is foolish.
Else at this point.
It's not foolish. That's what economists do.
Your data leaves so many anomalies.
What are you talking about?
Well, la 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 la.
In this video, we're going to watch a panel of 4 intellectual titans go head to head on the idea of progress. Does the future look brighter from now on or darker? And this debate is actually from 2015, which makes it all the more fascinating with hindsight. There is 71% of the audience is on the side of Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley, and 29% is on the side of Malcolm Gladwell and Elaine de Botton. So it's a big mountain to climb for them. And at the end of this debate, I'm going to show you just how these scores changed. So with that, let's introduce our first speaker. Steven Pinker is an American cognitive psychologist and a very famous science author, particularly famous for his book Enlightenment Now, which if you haven't read, you definitely should.
Citizens of the world, I plan to convince you that the best days of humankind lie ahead. Yes, convince. As long as bad things haven't vanished from the earth altogether, there will always be enough of them to fill the news, and people will believe, as they have for centuries, that the world is falling apart. No, the only way to understand the fate of the world is with facts and numbers. That is, plot the incidence of good and bad things over time, not just for charmed places like Canada, but for the world as a whole, see which way the lines are going, and identify the forces that are pushing them around. Allow me to do this for 10 of the good things in life. First, life itself. A century and a half ago, the human lifespan was 30 years. Today, it is 70, and it shows no signs of leveling off. Second, health. Look up smallpox and cattle plague in Wikipedia. The definitions are in the past tense. Smallpox was a disease, indicating that 2 of the greatest sources of misery in human existence have been eradicated forever. The same will soon be true for polio and guinea worm, and we are currently decimating hookworm, malaria, filariasis, measles, rubella, and yaws. Third, prosperity. 2 centuries ago, 85% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, that's down to 10%, and according to the UN, by 2030, it could be 0. On every continent, people are working fewer hours and can afford more food, clothes, lighting, entertainment, travel, phone calls, data, and beer. Fourth, peace. The most destructive human activity, war between powerful nations, is obsolescent. Developed countries have not fought a war for 70 years, great powers for 60 years. Civil wars continue to exist, but they are less destructive than interstate wars, and there are fewer of them. Sixth, freedom. Despite backsliding in this or that country, the Global Democracy Index is at an all-time high. More than 60% of the world's population now lives in open societies, the highest percentage ever. 7, knowledge. In 1820, 17% of people had a basic education. Today, 82% do, and the percentage is rapidly heading to 100. 8, human rights. Ongoing global campaigns have targeted child labor, capital punishment, human trafficking, violence against women, female genital mutilation, and the criminalization of homosexuality. Each has made measurable inroads, and if history is a guide, these barbaric customs will go the way of human sacrifice, cannibalism, infanticide, chattel slavery, heretic burning, torture executions, public hangings, debt bondage, dueling, harems, eunuchs, freak shows, foot binding, laughing at the insane, and the designated goon in hockey. So what is the response of the declinists to all of this depressing good news? It is, just you wait. Any day now, a catastrophe will halt this progress or push it into reverse. But with the possible exception of war, none of these indicators is subject to chaotic bubbles and crashes like the stock market.
Almost prophetic there when he talked about this progress not being subject to reversal unless in the case of a serious war. And our next speaker is Elaine de Botton, a Swiss-born British author and philosopher. His works, including Essays in Love, which has sold over 2 million copies, emphasize the importance of philosophy in guiding our everyday life.
So if we're going to be optimists like our learned friends on the opposing team, we're really going to look at distilling the themes that Stephen and Matt are going to talk about to 4 things. Let's look at the 4 areas where optimists think we're going to make the largest gains. They are believers in the victory of knowledge over ignorance. Ignorance, a big scourge of our times, will be resolved through the light of reason. That's the great hope of the optimists. Poverty will be wiped out through the growing economies of the world. We will no longer have desperate ills of poverty that have accompanied us for so long. The third point, war. War will be wiped out by the rule of law and the increasing monopolization of power by states that follow international regulations. And lastly and fourthly, disease will be wiped out through that wonderful tool, medicine. And with those 4 things, ignorance, poverty, war, and disease under control, we will land in the sunlit uplands that our optimistic friends want to tell us are on the way.
Now, guys, we are talking about some big existential issues in this video, ideas with great magnitude and profundity. But the biggest issue of all, and it's not just me saying it, I mean, anyone with eyes can see this, is that a lot of you guys haven't yet liked the video and subscribed to the channel and turn on all notification bells, because I've heard on the grapevine that that shit actually really triggers Kim Jong-un, and he might do something stupid. So do what you got to do, but I wouldn't advise pissing that guy off.
I've got one major objection, and it's a slightly autobiographical one. I'm Swiss. I'm a citizen of Switzerland, and I spent a bit of time there. And the thing about Switzerland is that it's solved all these problems. It's got a fantastic education system. The average salary is $50,000 a year. The country's been at peace since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and the hospitals are superlative. Yet, it's not paradise. Indeed, there are legions of problems. Problems that I would describe as first world problems, which are not jokes. They are genuine problems. Switzerland is where Swaziland and Botswana and Liberia may be in 500 years' time. But the bad news, ladies and gentlemen, is that Switzerland is not perfect. And it's for that reason that we have to discount the optimistic tenor of the motion tonight. Why is Switzerland not perfect and countries like it? Well, firstly, because idiocy is not removed by reason. The great promise of the Enlightenment was if you tell people what the right thing to do is, they will do it. That evil is the result of ignorance. It's not. Idiocy is more stubborn than that. Poverty is not eradicated by raising the GDP. There are millionaires and billionaires who feel they don't have enough. And that is the true definition of poverty, the sense you don't have enough. And unfortunately, that rises and is present at any income level. Someone may say, yes, but with machines and technology and the internet and the iPhone, we will perhaps gather together and produce a creature who is perfectly wise, who is perfectly kind and immortal. Maybe we will, but this person is not a human being. Homo sapiens is a different species. We will never be able to evolve out of these roadblocks that I've been telling you about. I believe that at the top of our spinal cords, we have what I like to call a faulty walnut. A walnut mind that has very destructive impulses, that is immune to certain kinds of education, and that resists any attempt to help it in many situations.
Our next speaker is Matt Ridley, a British scientist, journalist, writer, and businessman. Matt is famous for his book, The Rational Optimist, and more recently co-authored Viral, The Search for the Origins of COVID-19. And he did some fantastic work in this department, helping to shed light on the fact that the most likely origin for COVID was the lab leak.
What a pity we can't have a vote between who prefers bald Brits to curly-haired Canadians, but... I just lost 10 seconds with that. Woody Allen once said, "More than at any time in history, mankind faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness, the other to total extinction." Let us pray we have the wisdom to choose wisely. And that's the way pretty well everybody talks about the future. When I was young, the future was especially grim. The population explosion was unstoppable, famine was inevitable, pesticides were giving us cancer, the deserts were advancing, the oil was running out, the rainforests were doomed, acid rain, bird flu, and the hole in the ozone layer were going to make us sick. My sperm count was falling, and a nuclear winter would finish us off. You probably think I'm exaggerating. Well, here's what a best-selling book by the economist Robert Heilbronner concluded in the year I left school. The outlook for man, I believe, is painful, difficult, perhaps desperate, and the hope that can be held out for his future prospects seem to be very slim indeed. It was only a decade or two later that it dawned on me that every one of these threats had either been a false alarm or had been greatly exaggerated. The dreadful future was not as bad as the grown-ups had told me it would be. Life just kept on getting better and better for the vast majority of people. The human lifespan has been growing at the rate of 5 hours a day for 50 years. The greatest measure of misery anybody can think of, child mortality, has gone down by 2/3 in that time. Malaria mortality is down by an amazing 60% in 15 years. Oil spills in the ocean are down by 90% since the 1970s. An object the size of a slice of bread lets you send letters, have conversations, watch movies, find your way around, take pictures, and tell hundreds of people what you had for breakfast. And what's getting worse? Traffic, obesity, problems of abundance, note. Here's a funny thing. Most improvements are gradual, so they don't make the news. Bad news tends to come suddenly. Car crashes make the news. Falling child mortality doesn't. And as Steve says, every year the average person on the planet grows wealthier, healthier, happier, cleverer, cleaner, kinder, freer, safer, more peaceful, and more equal. More equal? Yes. Global inequality is on the way down, and fast. Why? Because people in poor countries are getting rich faster than people in rich countries. Africa is experiencing an astonishing economic miracle these days, a bit like Asia did a decade or two ago. Mozambique is 60% richer per capita than it was in 2008. Ethiopia's economy is growing at about 10% a year. The world economy has shrunk in only 1 year since the Second World War. In 2009, when it dipped by less than 1% before growing 5% the next year. If anything, the march of prosperity is speeding up.
And our next speaker is Malcolm Gladwell. Now, Malcolm is somebody that we have covered on this channel before, in a Monk debate actually, when he was debating against Douglas Murray and Matt Taibbi. It didn't go so well for him last time, and he didn't come across great, so let's hope it's better this time. Malcolm Gladwell is a Canadian journalist for The New Yorker, and also an author of 5 New York Times best-selling books, including Outliers, The Story of Success.
As I was listening to the two esteemed speakers for the proposition, Mr. Pinker and Mr. Ridley. By the way, I feel like we should come up with a term for them, a more elegant term. I would suggest maybe we call them the Pollyannas. And since we strangely don't have a woman on stage, which is odd since it's 2015, I thought we could more usefully refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna, and I will leave it to your imagination to figure out who is Mrs. and who is Mr., although I feel like a simple look at the contents of their scalp will give you some indication of which direction is appropriate. In any case, as I was listening to Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna, my mind wandered, as I'm sure many of your minds wandered as well. And I began to think of all of the possible scenarios under which I would agree with them. And so, for example, suppose we add just 3 words to the proposition, be it resolved that the best days lie ahead for Mr. Pinker and Mr. Ridley. That's absolutely the case. Mr. Ridley is a member of the House of Lords, one of the greatest sinecures in the history of the Western world. Mr. Pinker is on the faculty of Harvard University, which might usefully be described as America's answer to the House of Lords. It's absolutely the case their best days lie ahead. No one's going to dispute that. What I want to say is that the notion that the future is going to get better is hopelessly naive. And the word better is misplaced. What we really, I think, are facing when we look at the future is a future that's different. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I was recently at a conference and I was chatting with some people in the who were security specialists, internet security specialists. And I said, what do you worry about? What's on your mind? And they said, well, you know, we've done a very good job recently at dealing with the everyday, low-level threats that used to comprise the world of hacking. The guy from Bulgaria who wants to steal your credit card, right? There's thousands of those threats. We're doing a good job of keeping them at bay. But what terrifies us is what they called digital 9/11, right? Some nation state comes in, hacks their way into the electrical infrastructure of North America and shuts off the power for a week. That terrifies them. Or someone goes in, hacks into 1,000 cars simultaneously on the 401 and causes a massive traffic jam and car accident. Now, that might not be substantially different from the way the 401 is present time, but it would come as something of a shock. What do all these examples have in common? What they tell us is that as a society, we have been engaged not in the reduction of risk, but in the reconfiguration of risk. You don't have to worry about a famine every 5 years, but you have to worry about a mega hurricane coming along and wiping out Miami. You don't have to worry about a guy in Romania stealing your credit card, but you have to worry about North Korea coming in and shutting off the power for 2 weeks.
Firstly, can somebody let me know in the comments what Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna means? I mean, I know that there was a 60s TV show about a little girl named Pollyanna.
Don't tell anyone. But it's wonderful to be so rich, isn't it?
I don't know if it's relevant. Somebody let me know. So Malcolm goes straight for the identity politics, the personal attacks, and then the orange man bad. And I hate to say it, but Malcolm is just as sanctimonious in this debate as he was in the last one. And it's funny because he has a book called Talking to Strangers about how we misrepresent other people and other people's views and how we should be more tolerant towards everybody. Maybe he should revisit that one. Throughout this debate, you'll see that Malcolm Gladwell actually raises some really great points from time to time, and it's a shame that he goes for the personal attacks and doesn't just stick to his good points. But unfortunately, his debate tactic consists mostly of trying to get cheap laughs and straw manning.
I'll start with my response to Alain, which is twofold. First of all, I think Elaine de Botton has shown up to the wrong debate. I don't remember ever having been invited to a debate whose resolution is that in the future people will be immortal, nor that foolishness will evaporate from the surface of the earth, nor that we will never again lose our car keys. That is, the resolution of the debate is not that a perfect world is in our future, but rather the best days are to come. My second response is, are you serious? Are you willing to go to a peasant in Cambodia or Sudan or Bangladesh or Afghanistan and say, listen, I've been there, you worry about your child dying, your wife dying in childbirth, you're full of parasites, you don't have enough to eat, but trust me, it's no great shakes to live in a country like Switzerland.
Yeah. Matt, you're up next.
Well, Mr. and Mrs. Cassandra did a good job of giving you the other side of the story. I mean, seriously, Malcolm, are we to genuinely think that a big traffic jam caused by a teenager in Bulgaria is a big problem? I mean, there are far greater problems in the world, and I think one of the things that's interesting about the Cassandras is that they have told you about the problems of the developed world. They've told you about the problems of rich countries. But there's a billion, I mean, forget losing the grid for a few minutes because of a kid in Bulgaria who hacks into it. There's a billion people in the world who don't yet have access to electricity. And we know that when they get it, it transforms their lives. And we know that there's nothing stopping us getting it to it except will and resources and that kind of thing. If it was really true that cell phones, which give the average African the chance to do mobile banking, the chance to advertise his number so he can get a job, the chance to communicate with his friends relatively cheaply, if it was really true that which has brought wonderful improvements to people's lives was also making war worse, we'd see it in the numbers. And we're not. People were able to organize wars before cell phones, and they still will afterwards. And as for Alain, I mean, I think I heard you define poverty as a millionaire who thinks he hasn't got enough. I don't think that's poverty. I think poverty is when people really can't afford to feed themselves or to survive. And that's what I'm concerned about. I'm not looking back at the past, like Malcolm said. In fact, I specifically said I wasn't basing my optimism on that. I'm basing it on what we can achieve, what we know we can achieve, what we know we can do, and what we can bring out to improve people's lives, the people who really need it, which are the people in the developing world.
They are surrounded by voices like those of Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna who sell us a boosterish message. And there's nothing particularly fresh or interesting in what they're telling us. We hear all the time that we're heading for the sunlit uplands. Yes, there are a few voices in newspapers like The Guardian and The New York Times who will say that everything's grim, but these are minority voices. They loom large in the Pollyanna's imaginations because they move in those circles. But basically, in the world out there, the big megaphone is given to people who tell us that life is going to be perfect. This is what part of what I'm fighting against, because I think it's such a dangerous and inhuman philosophy. At the dawn of Western civilization, the ancient Greeks invented a form of theater that they called tragedy. And the point of tragedy was to remind a city-state of its constant vulnerability to reversal, and therefore of its need for extreme modesty in the face of the unknown. And this is what disturbs me so profoundly about Mr. and Mrs. Pollyanna. Their arrogance, they are themselves both charming people, but their attitude, and the attitude that goes with their views, is of an underlying, brittle arrogance, which I think is ultimately dangerous for us. They have an extremely materialistic view of human beings, as if the only concern that they have is the material side of life.
I've tried to make a list when I was listening to the two of them of statements that struck me as odd, and so I thought I'd just go through them. I have three that struck me as... The first one was by Mr. Pinker about how he was greatly cheered by the fact that the number of nuclear weapons had been reduced by 80%. Well, forgive me for pointing this out, but it doesn't actually solve the problem if you reduce the number of weapons by 80%, because all it takes is one weapon in the hands of one crazy person to blow us all up. It's a bit like the person with a gun to your head who says, "Don't worry, I've reduced the number of bullets in the chamber by 50%. I would not be terribly relieved by that. Perhaps Mr. Pinker would be. On my favorite Pinkerism, if I might coin a phrase, was another one he said, which was in talking of climate change, which he glossed over very quickly. He said he dismissed it with the phrase, and this, I just love this, economists agree it's a solvable problem. Now, where to start? Where to start? First of all, economists? Like, in what fantasy world do you imagine that economists are the first place you turn for solutions to life's most complicated problems? This isn't a problem that can be solved with demand curves and with moving the interest rate up or down a basis point. It strikes me as typical of the kind of intellectualized fantasy world that I think our opponents are living in, that they would look at this extraordinarily complex issue and turn for help to the economics department of Harvard University, or, as the case may be, the House of Lords.
Now, this debate is so fascinating to look back on now, because in my opinion, 2015 was a real high point for humanity. We were kind of standing atop the mountain of human achievement with a clear path upwards. And at that time, I definitely would have taken the side of Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley. And I'm sure you guys can see that their arguments are very convincing so far. But if you're anything like me when you watch this debate, you'll have that sort of sour taste in your mouth where you're thinking, damn, we were doing so well. And if only they knew how absolutely insane the world would go over the next 8 years. I mean, the pandemic and all of the subsequent results of that have set us back and potentially a very long way in our progress and development. And I think only in a few decades' time, when we get to really look back and assess the situation, will we understand the extent to which that set us back. And also, since then, we've essentially entered what some people are calling World War III. Certainly a time of serious geopolitical turmoil, and the closest we've gotten to a potential nuclear war since the Cold War. Plus, there are all kinds of geopolitical issues happening with the US dollar and new powers emerging around the world, and it feels as though right now in the year 2023, things are a lot less stable than they were in 2015. On to the next section of the debate now.
I mean, the notion that we're materialists, I think, is one that needs to be nailed, because it's all very well saying that materialism doesn't satisfy all of your needs. That's certainly true, but I think I would rather be well-fed and miserable than hungry and miserable. I think satisfying material needs does matter. And as for Malcolm's point about climate change and climate science, all I can hear from him is a counsel of despair. I can't hear him saying there's nuclear technologies, there's other technologies, there's things we can do. There are all sorts of things we can do. We're trying to summon the political will, we're trying to get the economics right, we're trying to get the technologies right. We haven't succeeded yet in decarbonizing the world economy, but to think that it's completely impossible that over the next few decades we could crack that problem is weird. I mean, we may not succeed, but it's pretty likely that we will.
The issue, if I might beg to differ, I never said that the issue was that it was impossible. Rather, I said that it was more difficult than you would lead us to believe in sort of, as you guys present all kinds of these fantastic scenarios about limitless progress. But more than that, that climate change represents a kind of threat to progress that is a different order than the threats we've seen in the past. And this goes back to my opening statement.
Is that really true? What about,
absolutely.
I mean, some of the things that in the past we've faced famine, we've faced disease. These were huge threats to human beings, and
you cannot point to a single famine that had the kind of global consequences that a consequential change in the climate of the Earth will have. Right? Name me a famine from years 0 through 1750 that had the effect of changing the fundamental structure of the world's oceans. Can't do it.
No,
right?
but I can name you a famine. I can name you a famine in France in the 1690s that wiped out 15% of the population of France because we didn't have trade, and so we couldn't get food to people in those days. But now, because of globalized agriculture,
I would suggest to you the kind of threat that we're talking about in climate change is a lot greater than 15% of the population.
15% of the population. Well, I think you're disagreeing with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, though.
Well, then I guess I'll have to live with that. That devastating fact for the end of my days.
If I could just say, these back and forths could get rather tedious if one team holds up a graph saying things are getting better, and the other one points out, no, but it could get worse, etc. I think we almost have to take a step back and say, what is driving this camp to want to assert so rigorously, from what center of your beings is this coming that you feel such a need to insist on something that you
from the data,
right,
from the facts.
Right.
I definitely agree with what Matt Ridley said about looking towards the developing world for progress more than anybody else in the debate at this moment. I think that it's absolutely clear that we have to be looking at those places if we're looking at human development, because the amount of change that can happen and the amount of positive good that can happen from giving people clean drinking water and lowering infant mortality rates and getting rid of disease and providing clean energy to these developing nations and fixing some of the problems with extreme corruptions and having free markets in these countries, the amount of human good that can do is on a completely different scale to us having a new version of an iPhone or whatever other comfort that we seek to have here in the developed world. And also, I would say that Elaine seems quite off the mark when he says that positive news is somehow the predominant news. I mean, anybody who watched the news for more than 2 minutes during the COVID pandemic would understand that fear sells. And during Trump's presidency, the reason why CNN's ratings were so high was because all they did was just stoke fear and division about Trump.
Don't be rude.
Can you give us a question?
I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically that nobody... No, Mr. President-elect, that's not appropriate.
This is essentially how these major news networks are still surviving. They have to instill fear and hate and division to keep people dependent on them and to keep people coming back for more all the time. If they were to just show videos of puppies playing with each other and cuddling each other the whole time, then it wouldn't sell. And hey, I think we're all pretty guilty of that, to be honest. I think we're all attracted to the drama, and that's just the way that human beings are. And interestingly enough, I know this is a minor detail, but generally when you're having a conversation with someone, and if you're looking at the other person's body language, when somebody touches their face a lot, this can actually mean incoming deception. So when somebody does this or this when they're talking to you, it can actually mean that they're about to lie to you. And notice that Malcolm Gladwell does this a lot. And he does it a lot when he's about to straw man them. I just found that really interesting. But furthermore, Malcolm Gladwell doesn't think that economists are relevant in this conversation. I mean, clearly he's safely ignored the work of Bjorn Lomborg. I mean, Bjorn Lomborg put together a team of economists and he figured out how we could spend $50 billion to make the world a better place. And guess what? Climate change didn't even get near the top of the list. And who would you want in charge of these policies and making these decisions anyway, Malcolm? Climate scientists? Well, that would plunge us into an energy crisis like we'd never seen before. But more on the idea of economists very soon. On to the next part of the debate.
Do you know a famous novel written in the 19th century called Anna Karenina? Now, the people in Anna Karenina, none of them suffered from your 10. Was it a happy story? No. And that tells us something very crucial, Mr. Pinker, about your narrow...
Did we claim we were going to abolish unhappiness?
This is another tactical retreat. Matt Ridley, this is another tactical retreat that you keep pulling off.
Not.
We
Happiness
define an area where you've lost, and we're not interested in that bit. We're only interested in the liverworm. So why don't you say what you are interested in and stick and defend it?
Alan, have you looked at the data on happiness? Happiness correlates with wealth between countries, within countries, and within lifetimes. It's perfectly true that you can be very wealthy and very unhappy, but that's all right because it cheers up other people. So
Alan, I think, is making a very good...
I mentioned a couple of things. First of all, the Easterlin paradox has been resolved. I think you're a decade out of date. The idea that wealth does not correlate with happiness, which is what the Easterlin paradox was, has been resolved. August Deaton just won the Nobel Prize a couple of weeks ago for showing that. And as Matt said, it was based on a fallacy.
Presumably there are some people in this room who are a little unhappy about various things, and they're not on the breadline. And you would go, well, I'm sorry, guys, but my data suggests that your happiness does not correlate with your income, and therefore your unhappiness is not really real, because the data doesn't show that it's real. In other words, your data leaves so many anomalies.
What are you talking about?
Well,
how does the data not show that someone's unhappiness is real?
I wanted to bring up one of the howlers that I didn't have time to go through in my rebuttal, which is on this very point, when he's talking about how we're a lot less murderous today than we were in the past, and points out that developed countries haven't fought a war for 60 years, major developed countries. But I would just simply point out, when they did fight that war 60 years ago, it was quite nasty, I think it's fair to say. So it goes to my point. It is of small consolation that the gap between wars is growing if the wars themselves are of terrifying ferocity, and if the wars themselves contain the possibility of the extinction of the planet. That, to me, is an extremely important point. So in pointing to the fact that there's been, 60 years since England engaged in a major war, doesn't tell us much, does it? We have to look very closely at the nature of that conflict. And that's why to return to the point I was trying to make at the beginning, when I said there has been a change in the configuration of risk. That's exactly the point. Wars have gotten less frequent, but more catastrophic.
So let's come.
Malcolm, I certainly agree that economists are an inviting target, and one can always get a laugh by making fun of economists. But the problem of climate change is an economic problem. The projections of the worst-case scenarios all depend on calculations of economists, namely how many people will burn how many units of fossil fuels.
It's defined effectively by economists, so that doesn't make it an economic problem.
It absolutely is an economic problem because it all depends on how many people will burn how much
It's like saying if an artist draws a still life of some apples, then apples are an artist's problem. Apple's not an artist's problem. An apple's a fruit that exists outside of the realm of artists.
Both the analysis of climate change and the possible solutions are economic problems. We know that we can have solar panels. The question is, will there be enough solar panels to reduce fossil fuel use? We know that a nuclear power can cut into carbon emissions. By how much? We know that people could reduce their consumption enough to mitigate the problem. Will they? Under what kind of incentives? So it's very much a problem of economics. And William Nordhaus's The Climate Casino is the most comprehensive analysis of the chemistry, the history, the economics, and the technology of climate change. He is an economist, not at Harvard, he's at Yale.
Your exchange perfectly, I think, encapsulates what Al and I have been arguing, which is there is something very narrow and almost precious in the way that you have chosen to look at the world.
You're very good at
that you take something,
Malcolm. You're very good at
you take something like climate change.
Facts?
No, hold on. I listened to you at great length. Agree with me on a position, so it's almost. Look, climate change is something that is effectively described by economists. That does not make it an economic problem. It is a problem to successfully confront climate change will require the successful coordination of many different disparate sectors of society on many different levels. To simplify it and to say this is something that we can reduce to a matter of economic analysis is foolish. I mean,
might I add something else at this point?
It's not foolish. That's what economists do.
Right.
Economics is the study of complex interactions across societies.
Malcolm with the snarky comments again. And I'm telling you guys, this is a real shame because some of the points that he's bringing up are kind of prophetic and also they're very relevant. And if he just stuck to that and really drove home those points and gave some statistics and backed up those points a little bit more, he'd have a very, very strong argument, especially when he talks about the change in the configuration of the risks, that the risks may not be as often, but they're certainly more extreme. And the risks that we do face these days could very much be interpreted as existential risks. So he's really onto something there. And now his partner, Elaine, not such great ideas in this one. He took a serious L here, and he dug himself into a bit of a hole by committing the most abhorrent strawmans, by saying that they believe in some sort of perfect utopian world, which is clearly not the case. Anybody who's listening to this would know that that's not the case, but they have a lot of statistics to back up their optimism, and that's pretty clear. And Steven Pinker was right about the fact that the Easterlin paradox has been disproven. And the Easterlin paradox, for those of you who aren't aware, is that long-term growth rates of income and happiness are not related, which is pretty clearly not true. I mean, Biggie says more money, more problems.
I ain't exaggerating at all, man. The more money you make, the more problems you get.
And the Beatles say money can't buy you love, and lots of people say money doesn't buy you happiness or money doesn't make you happy, but being broke sure makes you miserable. And on the economics argue, Steven Pinker absolutely destroyed Malcolm there and really showed a glaring ignorance. And then Malcolm just tries to interrupt him, which is a pretty cheap trick. But I mean, of course, this is an economics issue. And like he said, the job of an economist is to study many different aspects of society. And they study all kinds of data and statistics from all different kinds of angles to understand what is best for a society. Weird argument there by Malcolm, and I'm not sure what he thinks an economist is. On to the closing remarks now.
I would maintain that if you want to understand the world, which way it's going, which scenarios are likely, and most important, how to deal with them, science is the sophisticated way to address these problems, not the simplistic one. That is, if you want us to know what we should do to continue the trajectory to reducing disease, to reducing hunger, to increasing the lifespan, to getting kids to school, to reducing the threat for climate change, yes, science is where you should look, and no, it is not the simplistic way to deal with these problems or to analyze them. And again, nor is fiction or the appropriate way to figure out how to deal with the very serious challenges that we have. The way to deal with it is with science.
Okay, look, I'm glad that Stephen really nailed his colors. I mean, I didn't think he would come out with something so crass. He has. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to freeze the moment. One of our great scientists has said that literature is not real, it's made up. Okay? In other words, he's equating the fact of the work of the imagination as something that has no validity. Okay? This is one of our great minds. He is arguing this, and he is arguing that science has the answers and the humanities have none of the answers. This is what I thought I was terrified about. Stephen has reassured me that I was right to be terrified about it. Because it's precisely this attitude, ladies and gentlemen, that is so dangerous in scientists. The great scientists have known their limitations and have worked together with the humanities to understand the complexities of the human mind. What you have in front of you, ladies and gentlemen, is a specimen of a new kind of scientist who is so cocksure of what he and his lab can do that he has discarded 2,000 years of the insights of the humanities and of religion and of anything that lies outside of the scientific method. And this is highly reductive and highly dangerous. You know, it used to be the case that people who were very religious dreamt of a new Jerusalem, a new dawn, when all problems would be done away with through the light of reason. What these two gentlemen represent is a secularized, scientific version of that dream of building the new Jerusalem. It was dangerous then, and it's dangerous now.
A bit melodramatic and rude there by Elaine. I don't think he really accurately represented what Steven Pinker was saying, but I do get what Elaine is saying here. Scientists can be very dismissive of the more abstract. They can be very dismissive of the unbelievably complex ideas that the great thinkers of history have tackled, like your Nietzsche's and your Dostoevsky's, and even the ancient Greeks and the Stoics, and all of these fantastic literary figures. They don't necessarily put it in stats and figures and data, but in a more creative way, they tend to tackle these big issues. And I do agree with him when he says that disciplines like philosophy and art can stand shoulder to shoulder with the scientists to make life not perfect, but less painful. A beautifully articulated thought there by Elaine about the metaphysical, those intangible aspects of the human experience. And we should not be quick to dismiss those great thinkers. But how relevant is it to the topic of the debate? It doesn't hold as much gravity, in my view, as what Steven Pinker and Matt Ridley were saying.
Who is regarded by a large class of persons as a sage, said John Stuart Mill, but the man who despairs when others hope. In other words, we've always thought Cassandras were wise and Pollyannas were foolish. But history teaches us that this is the wrong way around. Cassandra was nearly always wrong. Pollyanna's rarely been cheery enough, given history. The apocalyptics of my youth were wrong to tell me that the future was grim is the word I was looking for, thank you. And they were wrong to teach me a counsel of despair about it. But don't go away with the idea that optimists like Steve and I think the world is perfect. I've no idea where Alan got that idea. Of course we don't think that. We think quite the reverse. We think this world is a vale of tears, a slough of despond compared with what it could be and will be in the future if we do the right things. I'm not an optimist by temperament, but by evidence. That's what changes my mind. We're not saying don't worry, be happy. We're saying don't despair, be ambitious. We're not saying everything's going to be okay. There's going to be war and pain and misery in the future, but there was even more in the past. And by the way, talking about the past, I'll give Alan a little bit of ancient Greece. Hesiod lived in the golden age of Greece, and even he complained that things aren't what they used to be. We've hardly started gathering the harvest of innovation that can improve people's lives in the future and heal the planet they live on. And that's what makes Steve and me different from Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide. Pangloss explains to Candide that the death of 70,000 people in the Lisbon earthquake must be for the best, because God made the world and he's not able to make an imperfect world, so they must have been bad people. Voltaire was actually teasing the theodicy of Leibniz and Maupertuis, perhaps because his mistress was sleeping with Maupertuis. There's every reason to think that the future is going to be bright, and I think you should vote for the motion if you think that.
Not saying don't worry, be happy, saying don't despair, be ambitious. This debate has been full of absolute bars. That one line there basically summarized everything he'd said in that debate just magnificently, and the best minds can do that, can distill those very complicated ideas and arguments to small, palatable and repeatable phrases like that. And Matt Ridley also really impressed me there with his knowledge of ancient philosophy and literature, a jack of all trades.
I wanted to talk about something that we haven't talked about nearly enough this evening, which is kind of astonishing, but maybe it's because the two esteemed gentlemen on the other side of this proposition have essentially spent the entire time with their hands over their ears and eyes saying, la, 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 la. What I'm talking about, of course, is nuclear war. And the story that always stays with me, and I think bears repeating this evening, is the story of what's known as the Petrov incident. There is a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov in the Soviet Air Force who one day on his computer screen sees a report of an incoming nuclear missile coming from the United States to blow up the Soviet Union. And he knows what the protocol requires him to do, which is if America has launched a first strike, he has to retaliate in full force. So what did he do? Well, he decided that it was a computer malfunction, and he didn't push the button. And his hesitation is the real reason that we're all here today, right? His hesitation is the reason that we're all here today. Well, the lesson of that's obvious. That couldn't happen in the 15th century, as miserable as the 15th century was. It couldn't have happened in the 16th and the 17th and the 18th and the 19th and the 20th up until 1940 or so, right? And this threat is a distinctly modern creation. And the notion that there could be a computer malfunction that could lead us to blow ourselves up the threat of that is as real today as it was 30 years ago in the Petrov incident, right? So I look at that and I return to the point that I made at the beginning of this debate. We have done extraordinary things over the last 100, 200, 300 years in reducing our interpersonal risks, in making progress in the everyday ways we live our lives. Mr. Pinker gave you 10 areas in which we have made that kind of progress. Matt Ridley gave you more. Everything they said is true, but it's beside the point, right? At the same time as we have reduced those interpersonal risks, we have increased our existential risks. And for you to vote for this proposition, you have to believe that trade-off leaves us better off. And it doesn't.
Odd way to start his remarks there. And you can kind of tell that the audience was a bit sick of it. He'd sort of exhausted all of the cheap laughs that he was going to get for the night. And then they were just a bit like, okay, just sort of say your remarks and stop being a dick.
La, 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 la.
And it made me feel pretty uncomfortable considering how Matt and Steve particularly had acted in such good faith during this debate. Just to have Malcolm Gladwell then come up and make rather strange personal attacks at times. I think that Malcolm has a distinct lack of self-awareness and a heightened sense of his own charisma. But nevertheless, he made some fine points about the increase in existential risks that we face, especially nuclear war. It's a very scary thought indeed to think that we are becoming so advanced in the area of defense or offense, if you might call it, that we could inflict such unspeakable damage on another nation and just in the click of our fingers. It would only take one madman to really ruin everything. One crazy person, or maybe a global synthesis of bad policies to make these most dire predictions come true. Only time will tell, I guess, if that comes to fruition.
The cure for cognitive fallacies is data, and the trend lines are unequivocal. On average, people are living longer, healthier, richer, safer, freer, more literate, and more peaceful lives. While past performance is no guarantee of future returns, the world is not Wall Street. We are unlikely to wake up one morning and face a world with smallpox, slave auctions, or surgery without anesthetics. To be sure, the world faces formidable challenges, and that brings me to my final point. Optimism is a self-fulfilling prophecy. so is pessimism. The progress we enjoy is not the result of some mysterious historical dialectic or law of inevitable progress or arc bending toward justice. It is the result of people spotting problems, including nuclear proliferation and fragility, and instead of moaning that we're all doomed, applying their ingenuity and their efforts to solving them. A recent survey showed that people who believe that our way of life will end in a century also endorse the statement, the world's future looks grim, so we have to focus on looking after ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, don't be among them. It's irresponsible enough to be a fatalist when the objective indicators say the world is getting worse, all the more so when they say the world is getting better.
Now, I am an optimist, and I do tend to still, despite everything, agree with Steven Pinker here, that human beings can apply their ingenuity to solve the most unbelievable of problems, and that free market capitalism and the competition created from the free market is enough of a force to solve just about anything. So Pinker and Ridley actually gained 2%. And to be honest, I thought that they might have gained a little bit more than that. But it just goes to show that de Botton and Malcolm Gladwell actually made some fine points themselves. And this was such a great discussion, and I feel like it's something that we're profoundly lacking in the world these days. And I hope that we do get more of this in the future, and that Monk Debates continue to do what they do, because they just host some awesome debates. And it's the third one I've covered on this channel, and I'll be covering many more in the future. But let me know what you guys think. I personally think that 2015 was a high point for humanity, and that Pinker and Ridley were right at the time. But in hindsight, as much as I hate to say it, I think Malcolm Gladwell was probably the one who was most on point with the risks that he identified and pinpointed. So leave me a comment, guys. Can't wait to hear your thoughts on this one. And if you want to watch another video, click right here. But if you want to subscribe to the channel, click right here. Until next time, I'm Jake. This is Rattlesnake TV, keeping you armed and dangerous.